All right, the third area of our framework we're going to talk about next is boundaries. And you'll notice we're going to go a little faster than with the other parts of the framework. And that's because we've been talking about boundaries since the beginning of the training. Because these areas, again, they all fit together. They're not just separate areas. They do hold, they all go together. But I do want to say a few more things by way of clarity about the importance of boundaries. And when I use the word boundaries, I just mean clear expectations for appropriate conduct is another way to say it, right? Safe behaviors, healthy behaviors. And of course, a lot of that gets to policy and what we are doing with our policy. Having clear expectations of conduct are essential to prevention. They impact a couple of the major ways that prevention works. So as we've mentioned already, a lot of prevention is actually deterrence. Just want to socialize people into what is expected and what is healthy. And certainly boundaries help with that. Some people grow up in families where there aren't healthy boundaries and interactions, and this is a good way to help them mature. It certainly sends a message to bad actors that, hey, this is okay, this is not okay, and we're trying to deter it by saying, we understand that distinction, and we are committed here that we are a place where there are healthy behaviors that really matters to us. and certainly with children, socializing children into those healthy behaviors is also essential because, as we said, a lot of boundary crossing and even abuse is coming from other minors. So that really helps by having those clear expectations with deterrence, but then it also sets us up to intervene when someone is trying to test and push past those boundaries. The key, again, a key with this is that it's the whole community. It's not just rules for those who work with students or those who work in the kids' worship or Sunday school program. It's in the hallways. It's in the fellowship hall and sanctuary after church. It's, when we gather at a home to have a prayer group or a small group and things like that. It's about how we live as a community. And, again, churches will call us and say, well, there's a guy who keeps interacting with this kid after church and it's all concerning, but he doesn't work with the students or serve with the kids ministry. So there's nothing we can do about that, right? What do you think? Do you think there's anything they can do about that? If someone is interacting with a kid in a concerning way just after church and they're not a formal staff member or a formal volunteer, can we still do something about that? Absolutely, we can still do something about that. We must do something about that. So, as we've said multiple times, what I found just a simple but effective way to think about it is when we talk about these expectations, the key is not to focus on the negative aspect of it, but the positive, and to continue to frame it positively and to connect it to our Christian faith. That, again, is powerful. It gets you traction with people. We're not just trying to be a stick in the mud. We're trying to, as a community, set positive expectations for safe behaviors. And that really impacts the safety of our community. You don't have to listen to boundaries are always going to be somewhat contextual to a community. If I was a pastor again, I would want my church to really think about 5 boundaries like these for the whole community. When I was growing up, we were members of a community pool, and people were on the board, and there were bylaws, but none of us kids cared about those bylaws, and none of those families ever read those bylaws unless you were on the board of the pool. But guess what we all read and we all knew about? It was the 5 rules they painted on the wall. And one of the rules was do not run, because guess what? Little Billy one day was running and really, pinged his skull pretty good. So that was written up on the wall. And that's the way I kind of think about this with boundaries for a whole church community. Are we going to have policies and more details for our staff who are employees? Of course we will. And are we going to have some more specific things for our student volunteers? Sure we will. and for our nursery workers. Sure we will. But it's good to think about a few key boundaries that everyone in the church kind of has in mind that set a base expectation for a few of the most important boundaries with touch, with our words, with isolation. And we know those are not arbitrary areas. We know these are often the key points that offenders are looking for and trying to exploit. So that's why we have these. So again, you don't have to take our recommendations, but having, it's good to have a list of, hey, in student ministry or kids ministry, this type of touch specifically is appropriate, this is specifically inappropriate, good. But for everyone in the church, just to have, all touch should be welcomed by the other person. That's just basic respect, I think, and that's a good baseline boundary. I don't know how many times in a training, like in a break, a woman usually has come up to me and said, so there's a guy in our church who gives hugs to women, and women don't want those hugs. Or there's some kind of other contact like that that's unwelcome, that's not wanted, that's creepy. But setting that expectation that basic respect is healthy touch is welcomed by the other person, whether it's a child or an adult, is a really just good standard baseline boundary. That touch in a power differential should be accountable to others. That's important. Again, we've talked about isolation, not being alone. Again, if it's your own kid, no problem, it's fine. And then outside of the kids' ministry, having only a parent or guardian involved in diapering or assistance if there's an accident with like a kid who's potty training. And then just respect in words. We don't use words here that shame, that belittle, that are sexual, right? We don't, because that's a boundary that many abusers are trying to test. They're trying to bring up the idea of sexuality in words, in stories, in sharing experiences to tell the teenager, well, those other kids aren't mature enough, but you're different. And then they're going to try to move the kid from talking about that to engaging in that sexual behavior. And that's about testing and looking for an opportunity, trying to move it to a more isolated setting. But if we have a baseline of, hey, words, you just don't have those conversations around teenagers. That's just not appropriate. And certainly for a pastor, in other settings where there's a power differential, like with an employee. So I have people that I supervise in my job. It's not appropriate for me to talk about sexuality or sexual experiences and stories with people over whom I supervise in my work. That's just not okay. That's not appropriate. So having a few baseline boundaries, and of course your policy team, working on that, thinking about that, that really matters. Having a team that will document boundary violations is also critical. So I'm gonna tell you a story. I did this very training at a large church a few years ago, and afterwards, a few weeks later, a pastor in the church called me. And he said, hey, Mike, I need to talk through something with you. He reached out and we set up a conversation on the phone. And he said, okay, here's what's been happening. After your training, a few weeks later, a mom was talking to one of our elders. And the elder just mentioned in passing that we had done this training with you guys. And the mom said, oh, you did a training on this with with our leaders, and, can I tell you something that I saw at our junior high Christmas party? The mom was a chaperone because her daughter was in the junior high ministry. She was a chaperone at the junior high Christmas party, and she told the elder she was at the party and she saw a male volunteer, probably in his 40s, walk past a junior high girl, reach out his hand, and caress down her face. Like in a weird, like, what? What is that? That's weird. And she saw it, she noticed it, she was concerned about it. And so she said she watched that guy the rest of the night, and he did it 2 more times to the same girl. But what didn't she do? She didn't tell anybody, until the elder mentioned the training. That gave her enough encouragement that the leaders are working on it, someone would take her seriously. She didn't have any direction or empowerment. So she told the elder. The elder talked to a pastor. They went to the leaders of the student ministry and said, have you seen any other concerns from this volunteer? And then the pastor calls me because they said, well, the leaders of the student ministry said they have like 6 or 7 other general concerns about this guy. So on this conversation, I said, okay, what are they? And he listed them. And I said, okay, you called them general concerns, but none of those are general. You listed very specific things that this guy's been observed doing that are concerning. Now, in that conversation, it doesn't do me any good to tell that church what to do. Do I have any authority to do so? Is that my job? No. But, okay, by the way, do you need like 7 or 10 concerning interactions from a volunteer to know they're not a good fit to work with students? You don't need that many usually. But what matters is, number one, that we give training to people so they can see some of those things, but then they have clarity to know, what do I do with that information, right? And that information is getting to one place. So if, just again, hypothetical, if you see a concerning interaction in the hallway one Sunday between an adult and a minor, maybe you even intervene, but you don't tell anyone else, and you think, well, that's resolved. And maybe it was resolved in that moment, but then you see it 3 weeks later, the same person, and then someone else sees it a month later. If we don't bring that information together to see this person is continuing to do these things that test those boundaries, we need to escalate our response because this is more serious. Sometimes there is a one-off where someone crosses a boundary, it's immaturity or whatever, we don't even know. We resolve it, we deal with it, and that's it. That does happen. But someone who is a bad actor, what's often missed is that there is a pattern of testing those boundaries. And so we don't want to create paranoia, but we do encourage leaders to just have a procedure where that information is coming to one place so it can be documented. That way, churches are going to see some concerns sooner than they would have otherwise. Now, we still hold that information with great discretion, and we don't immediately presume someone is an abuser based on a boundary violation. That's not the point. However, many times we benefit from seeing more information, and that is absolutely critical to a response that's more proportional and appropriate, if that makes sense. So that's, again, that takes a little bit of thought, some care, but in our view, that really makes a difference. And just giving people some concrete direction, like, hey, remember, you can talk to any of our leaders if there's something that's a policy violation or a concern. Give them some examples, and we'll do this in the congregation-based training. We'll give them examples, like, hey, if you do see someone isolating a child, if you can interrupt it, please do, or get someone who can. And if, make sure that's a leader knows about that so it can be documented. That really makes a difference. And then certainly, it goes without saying, there are situations where we do have to remove people from working with students or being on staff. Or, look, they're not on staff, they don't volunteer, but they keep going over to test this boundary. We need to tell them, no, there's a further boundary now for you because you won't respect this. So that man who fixates on the 5-year-old boy in the foyer every week in ways that everyone notices and is weirded out by, we have to tell that man, you are not to initiate contact with that 5-year-old, and see how he responds. And how he responds will tell us a lot. If he doesn't respect that, we have to escalate further. That's proportional. Now, that takes wisdom. And that's why we encourage, you don't put that on one person to make those decisions. You have collective wisdom, and you talk through the circumstances, and you make a judgment. And certainly we're here if there are situations you feel like you need to process through or talk through. If we can help you with that, we are glad to do so. At the end of the day, of course, as we've been saying, it's not about what we put on paper. It's how we're moving our community to live it out together. And as I already kind of mentioned this, it's not about that one-year event where we talk about this issue. It's about we make connections to this priority as we go throughout our church year. When we pray, when we give an announcement, when we send emails or have a newsletter, in a sermon, in a Sunday school lesson or whatever we're doing, we try to make a connection to these important realities that we are people who, within these safe boundaries, we're building trust with one another. And these are the boundaries and expectations. And, that takes all of us working together. All right, there's a few ideas here. Again, it's meant for you to come back and reflect on. What does that look like? Things to think about, things to talk about together. So I'm not going to go through those, but they're in the slides for you to come back to. All right. The last area is accountability. And one thing for leaders, if I was a pastor again, one thing I would be thinking of is I would want every adult in my church to know, what do I do if there's potential abuse? And that's what our training with the whole church will do. It will give them very clear direction about that. But also if there's a policy violation or some other safety concern. You can't put every concern in a policy. That would be a terrible policy. It would be way too long. That's not helpful. But just, you need a catch-all category. And I would just think about, how do I remind people and give them empowerment? Hey, remember, if you have a question about our policy or a concern, remember you can always talk to one of our leaders about that. And just, give them some empowerment direction. If someone's violating our policy, remember you need to talk to a leader about that. And then certainly, the policy will define what we do if there's potential abuse. So for reporting child abuse and abuse against vulnerable adults, in California, there are some who are legally required to report it. And in our view, it's, teachers, social workers, law enforcement, medical professionals, and some churches now that California's recently updated some of their laws. It's really just better, in our view, to take a view that as a church we have a policy that we report child abuse. And whether or not that's required or by law, we view it as an ethical obligation. Victor Viets, one of our founding board members, he's still on our board. Victor is a national expert in child abuse research, and he spent his whole career training professionals and churches and all sorts of other communities on abuse issues. Victor has told me that since mandated reporting laws have been put in place across all 50 states, the most egregious cases of child abuse, which are child deaths, those have dropped 50% since those laws have been implemented. So there's been some real good that has come out of those laws. And it's important, I think, to just have a clear reporting policy. So as leaders, for us to understand that and promote that matters. We were going to go through this in detail with the whole church, but just quickly, a few words. Of course, if there is violence happening now or an assault has just happened, we call 911. If we think a child is in danger right now and it's super immediate, we just call 911. We all know that. Otherwise, there's a countywide system in California for child abuse. You call social services, and for San Diego County, which we're in San Diego County, is that correct? Okay. Google has never failed me on this, but I always like to ask. So there is a number that is Child Welfare Services that's 24 hours. They have a local and 800 number. We like to encourage churches to just put in policy that it's good to report to social services or child welfare services and local law enforcement. Those two agencies are different. They have related, goals. Child Welfare Services is in charge of assessing the safety of that child in their environment, essentially. That's one of their main jobs. Of course, law enforcement, their job is to assess have any crimes been committed to uphold the law. And those are related, obviously, and there's supposed to be efficient communication between agencies, but that does not always occur. So in our view, it's better just to call both as soon as you can and give them that information. And when you report, by the way, you're not accusing someone personally. That's not what a report is. A report is just giving information that potentially will impact the safety of a child. It is their job to assess a child's safety in their environment. It is law enforcement's job to assess, is this a potential crime, to do any investigative work that might need to be done to assess that. You're giving them information. They should be documenting it and assessing it, and that's their role. That's not our role as church leaders. When you are, like if you do have someone here at church who is a teacher, and that means they're a mandated reporter, that means they don't just need to call but follow up with a specific form after they do the first call and that report. And when you talk with a person on the hotline, they should direct you where to send that form. So again, we'll go through this with everybody. There is a specific tip line for when there's online exploitation of children. So if there's a family in the church and the student has been, and I know this is, for some of us, this is like, what? That happens? But it does happen. A child is told, a student is told, hey, we've been friends on social media, and, they get tricked into sending someone a photo, and then they say, now if you don't send me $200, I'm going to share this photo with all of your family and all of your friends. So that does happen, things like that. So if you find yourself with a family dealing with that, know that the cyber tip line, they have specialists who are really good at trying to really help families in that awful situation. And so it's run by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and the FBI. So they work together to try to get those types of photos of minors off the internet and help those types of situations. So it's good for people to have a knowledge that that exists if there's a need. We report child abuse in part, not just because it's often the law, but because children can't act for themselves. And the same is true of vulnerable adults. So if there is a situation of elder abuse, like someone is living in assisted living and facing abuse in that setting, or someone has an intellectual disability, and they're an adult, but they have this intellectual disability, they're not fully able to act for themselves, it's good that we are having a policy to report on their behalf as well. And we would recommend the same thing with this situation, that there is a report to both social services, or adult protective services specifically, and to local law enforcement. In California, there's an online form that you guys can use as well. As you don't even have to call, you can submit the form online. That's another way to report. For law enforcement, I think you just need to call them. And again, you would call in the county the specific precinct you think the abuse may have occurred. So if it's in a neighboring county where it might have occurred, you would call that local police department and or social services. In the safeguarding training we do with the whole congregation, we're going to talk through these issues in more depth. And we're going to give them the 3 common scenarios where you need to report and give lots of examples of what that means and what that looks like. So there will be a lot more on that we're not going to do today because that's coming, and all of you will get that together, if that makes sense. But for you as leaders, the heart of it is, as a leader, to remember, if you are in that position, if you are a child, if you are a person experiencing abuse, what would you want someone else who held power to be doing for you, to help you, to love your neighbor as yourself in that way? And I really think that's the Christian way to think of it. We have to put ourselves in the shoes of a child, or a vulnerable adult, or a non-vulnerable adult, and keep our focus where it needs to be. So there's no easy roadmap for leaders, but what we want you to think about is taking a team approach matters. Bringing a few, it's not going to be tons of people. You have to handle situations with great discretion when there is a credible allegation. But to have a few key people who are assessing, we boil it down to 4 key issues that we think leaders need to keep in mind after a report, after an allegation, after there's potential abuse. And that's just always, number 1, assess safety. So if you have information that there is a credible allegation that a child has been, let's say a child has been assaulted, and let's say it's by someone on your staff. Well, it's not safe for that child to have to come to church with that person, right? In most cases. Now, there are plenty of cases where we have advised churches, you are not to tell that person they can't come to church right now because you're tipping them off that you've reported this to the authorities. So there's a lot of tension here, and that's why the 4th one is on here. You might have questions that you need to reach out to someone who has more experience who can help you think through this. So very often, you're going to assess safety issues like, okay, how do we not have this person, when they're, again, not a wild allegation, this is a true story. Someone said, there's a person came to our church, we have no one knows her, there's no record of her, and she told our church leadership that she had a dream that the pastor abused someone. Well, is that a credible allegation? No, it is not. This woman has never been in this church. No one knows her. And the allegation itself is even, she had a dream about something. That's not a credible allegation. That's not what most allegations are in churches. We're not saying any allegation, but most allegations come from people we know are a part of our church. And that would be very difficult for them to speak up about someone who is also known and a part of our church. So when that comes to light, we do have to begin to ask questions about, okay, do we put someone on leave? Do we ask them not to come? How do we create safe space, at least for a time, until we know more? So that's an issue that we have to address. That impacts safety. Other things, and we talked about this a little bit before, just asking someone, what can we do to help you feel safe? Is there anything we can do for you? And then, so drawing lines of accountability. And drawing a line of accountability does not mean you're saying they're guilty, by the way. You're saying this is serious, and this is a credible allegation, so we're having to put in a temporary boundary, at least for a time, until there is a more formal process that plays out. So those are judgments that churches very often have to make. And you have to look at the totality of the circumstances, and you have to make wise judgments. Again, that's where reaching out to those who have more experience is often a good idea. And then certainly initiating care for someone who has been hurt. That really matters. But there are always questions that come up that you cannot fully prepare for ahead of time. And every situation is its own situation. It's unique. So, really to me, it's about a framework that as leaders, we are taking a team approach and we're attending to the most important things. And situations develop. And you just have to come back to these most important areas as the situation develops. So if the situation is the first word of it, and this does happen, is a prominent person in our church has been arrested. Sometimes that's the first thing you get. Well, then you bring together people, a few key people, and you say, okay, how are we gonna assess safety given what we know? Well, after a few weeks, guess what? You probably have more information now, and you might need to revisit that. The same with accountability or discipline, and then care and other things like that. So does that make sense? There's no easy answers here, or you can't just put a flow chart in a policy that says it's always these things and this is how it always goes. It just usually doesn't work that way, unfortunately. So it's about keeping your focus on the most critical areas, and it's about keeping that heart of what is most important, if that makes sense. Do you have things that you want to ask about that or talk about? Does that make sense?
So does that mean like your policy is more general? Any policy formula is more general, and then what you communicate is also more general? Just an attitude and a culture of awareness, so that when you see something weird or someone's arrested or something, you deal on a case-by-case basis?
I think it can have some specifics.
Okay.
Like a specific thing would be, we will assess, if it's a staff person, we will assess whether they are put on leave or not, but you do have to look at each case on its own. Yeah, absolutely. And so having a framework for that, and then using your very best judgment and wisdom to look at the circumstances and, follow through with actions that are in line with your priorities and your values. That's what counts, I think. Other thoughts or questions? When it's a non-vulnerable adult, and I realize I'm using that word in a certain sense. When a pastor, singles out an adult who they don't have an intellectual disability, but they are vulnerable relative to the pastor, right? And are preyed upon, and that's the right language. That there's often a tension, because most advocates will say, we let that adult decide whether they want to report that, if they've been assaulted, for example, or have experienced intimate partner violence. Well, those are crimes, typically, depending on the severity. And whether that adult decides to report it, that's often his or her choice. At the same time, if we have information that abuse may have occurred, that may impact the safety and decisions we make about the situation in our community. So if we know a man is violent in his home and works with students, that raises safety issues, right? And even whether he's around other people. That raises questions. So there's no easy answers there, but we would encourage you to, yes, make it clear that it is up to an adult whether they report a crime like an assault or something to the police or not. Make it clear if they want to, we will be supportive in any way we can. At the same time, what is going to happen with that information if it comes to a leader, for example? Some adults are not ready to talk about that or have the information go anywhere. They don't want that. They just want to talk to someone confidentially to process their experience. And that's totally understandable. So to have some local resources or national resources in our policy, like the National Domestic Violence Hotline, or there's a National Sexual Assault Hotline. I'm sure in your community you have some resources here locally that you might also point people to. That, hey, if you need resources, if you just want to talk to someone, talk to an advocate, and it's confidential. There are paths for that. When I was a pastor, if I ever pastored again, I can't imagine if someone comes and tells me someone in our church assaulted me, that I wouldn't be thinking, okay, now I have to take some action to assess issues of safety for the whole community. Does that make sense? So making it clear for adults, if you come to a leader, we can't promise you we won't take things forward to assess certain things. That might have to happen because we might feel conscience bound to take some steps to assess the safety of the whole community. Does that make sense? And there are some advocates who would tell me, but Mike, you can't do that. An adult needs to have that agency and their choice respected. And I say, look, I understand that. I get that, and I think in most cases, I totally am with that. However, there absolutely is a tension at times between what an individual adult survivor wants and even needs, and that is best for them, for their health, for their healing, and what might be best for the whole community. That can be in a real tension, because this is the real world, and the real world is complicated. So what I would encourage you guys to do is, again, we just have to think through that as leaders, be aware of that tension, and I think it's good to just bring clarity for an adult to say, here are confidential paths for you to get help and resources. Here are church paths and resources, but if, again, it goes through a church path with our leaders, likely that means we're going to want to assess what are the implications of this for safety, for accountability, for our church community. And so I think just being upfront with people is the best policy. But I would say it's the same 4 areas as with kids or vulnerable adults. So let's say you do get information as leaders about intimate partner violence. It comes back to the same core issues. What issues of safety does this raise? What lines of accountability might be appropriate? What care might be appropriate? And what resources or other support do we need to engage with? When I was a pastor, there was a young couple started attending our church. They were dating. And one Sunday after church, he wasn't there, but after church, he called her on the phone, and she took out her phone and was talking to him. And then several of us nearby heard the verbal abuse being directed at her on the phone. So we talked to her right away, a few of us there, and said, you're an adult. You have to make your decisions. But we just want you to know that no one should ever talk to you this way. That is not okay. That's abusive. And you do not ever deserve to be talked to that way or treated that way. We talked to her about the connection between verbal abuse. It often starts with verbal abuse, but very often leads to more severe forms of abuse. Because of trauma-informed principles like choice and agency, we said, we're very clear. You have to decide what you're going to do. Whether you stay with him or break up with him, that's your choice, not ours. But we will tell you, if you want to attend here and come here and have him not here so you can feel safe, we will absolutely make that happen. And we will tell him he cannot come, and we'll meet with him. We still care for him, but we are going to meet with him and talk to him about this. And so we were able to offer her support. We said, look, if you want to, look at other resources, whether it's, legal resources or others, we're glad to connect you with those. We made those available to her. And she did decide, you know what, I do want to come and not have him come. And that was her choice. So we talked to him and said, you cannot come. And so we called the police department and said, look, this verbal abuse was it's not verbal abuse is never going to be usually pursued at all by police, right? But we called them to say, we have asked this person not to come. We don't think he's going to come, but if he does, we're going to call you. And they said, yep, we know where you guys meet. We'll be right there. Just call us right away and we'll come. So we made a plan. We had resources we could offer her. We offered her support, but we were giving her agency and choices all through that. So, and that was a little more, that's an easier situation to navigate when two people are recently started dating than when people have been married for 20 years. Okay, and have been a part of your church for 8 years or something. That's very different and it's more difficult. But I think you come back to the same core issues and you get help to help you think through what might be responsible. Questions or thoughts? Yes.
So the approach with an adult, hey, there's someone you could talk to assess the situation in a confidential way, but as a pastor or as a church, there's this other aspect we'd have to consider. We try and let go. So I see that with an adult. I've had people ask, hey, are you a mandated reporter? And
yeah,
I am. And so I tell them that, and then they want to talk to me about a situation either with their own parenting or with their kid. Is that kind of same approach something that could be handled in childhood? Hey, there are resources you could talk to assess that? Or?
Yeah, it's, that's why your policy is on paper so people can know what the policy says. So that means if they disclose the potential abuse, we report it, and there's no assessing of whether we report it or not. We just report it. Yeah. And so that clarity, that matters both with children and with adults. So, yeah.
And they could also call CWS or something instead of talking to me about it directly.
Correct. Yeah.
And that's still doing good stuff because they're
absolutely
assessing that.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're not investigators in the church. And so that they need to be doing that as an independent outside agency anyway. So yeah. Now, when we have knowledge of that, that's where in the church our role can be safety in our community. We do have responsibility for that. We do have responsibility for, and that gets to the boundary issue of someone's presence. Is it safe now for them to be here? And how do we think about that? And then the care we initiate. And that's where, we do have to ask people and say, look, for a survivor, they may not want us to have a care team for them and come and meet with them every week. They don't want to talk about it every week, or that's just too much. They don't want that. So we ask them permission. We ask, is this okay? Or how can we follow up in ways that are best when we check in? And we just try to have communication around that. Yeah. Good. About 15 states now have criminalized clergy sexual abuse, which is very good. So like, it's shocking to some churches when I tell them, like in a consultation, okay, you're in New York, or my state's Virginia, if this happened in Minnesota or Delaware or Tennessee or Texas or Wisconsin, your pastor could be facing criminal charges. Now, assault against anyone is always a crime in every state. Stalking is a crime, by the way. Of course, any kind of child sexual abuse is always a crime, no matter what state. But when a pastor crosses a sexual boundary with a non-vulnerable adult, in about 15 states, that has now been criminalized because they recognize physically overpowering someone in an assault is not the only way you can abuse power, like we've been talking about. So just for states like California and Virginia, where that's not been criminalized, to my knowledge, if you have questions, consult your legal counsel. We as Christians should, of course, still understand it as a deep betrayal, a deep abuse of power, and we should treat it as the serious abuse of power that it is. I mentioned resources. The national ones will often help you find local ones if you need help with that. But Google's your friend. Just find the local nearest domestic violence shelter. If there's a sexual assault resource center, if there's a child advocacy center, it's good to just list those in your policies. And it's good for all of us, especially as leaders, for us to know if someone comes to us and starts opening up about something they're hard like this they're dealing with, for us to know the local, for us as a church to maybe even reach out to the local domestic violence shelter to know what services they offer, to know what county or areas they serve. Because the worst thing is when we recommend, oh, go to this place, and they go to that place, and that place says, will you live in this next county? And we don't serve you because you don't live in this county or in this area. Or you need this service, but we don't provide that service, this other agency does. So you can't do it overnight, but to do a little reconnaissance on what resources are around, what they offer, what limits and restrictions as far as like who they serve and things like that, that matters. When you need that information, you need it. So to do the work ahead of time so you're ready, that can really, really matter. So encourage you to think about that. And then sometimes there are allegations and we report and nothing happens. And that's common. Or it's an adult who's not ready to report it to the police, and so there's not going to be a police investigation because they're not reporting it to the police. So what do we do? There are cases like that where there is factual clarity and there's not really a doubt of what has happened. So there are cases like that where we have what we need to move forward for safety, for accountability. We may just need some support as we try to carry that out and do our very best. But there are definitely cases where the facts are in dispute and the person says, nope, that did not happen. And there is a lack of factual clarity. And there are definitely cases where it doesn't seem to be forthcoming from like law enforcement. That's not going to be investigated. So it's important in that case to come back to the common dynamics we've been talking about, that very often when someone has abused power, it's not just the victim. If that did occur, that has been groomed, but it's often the whole community. And that means not only are we not trained to be investigators ourselves, we're the last people who should be investigating because we are not independent. And so and that's why we have a whole wing of our organization who has, law enforcement or former law enforcement or former prosecutors who have investigative experience, who conduct independent investigations. Those are not always needed, and they are an investment. They're time consuming, they can be expensive. But at least getting independent consultation, and in some cases, independent investigation is worthwhile. So just keeping that in mind, if someone from my own church called me today and said, Mike, we've got this allegation, you deal with this stuff, we need you to help us investigate, I would say no. Yes, I have more education than most, but that's not appropriate because I would know the people involved. My church is small enough. I would know almost certainly some of the people involved, and that's just not appropriate. Given the dynamics we know about abuse, about grooming, about how that double life works, and how that manipulation is often operating, we need someone who is independent. So just a word to all leaders, we always say. And then, of course, knowing we're not the only ones who have, experts on these issues. There are, plenty of other resources and agencies you can reach out to, people who can help you. So you're not alone. All right. I want to make sure if you have questions that we have some time for that. I just want to revisit, though, our main goal. I know this is a lot. 4 hours, we've spent a lot of time together. This is a lot to take in. The reason we give you this framework is because we want to recognize we're all in process, right? You're already doing really amazing things, really good things. That's why you've invited us in. It's because you already have a heart for this, and you're already working on these issues. So I just want to encourage you to keep going. And I hope this framework has been helpful. Again, the slides are here for you to come back to and continue to process through. So there's 2 things I want to close with. The first is, you can't take it all in or do it all at once. You have to just take a break, first of all. Take a few days, take a couple weeks even. But then I really would encourage you to come back to these slides and spend some time reflecting on your major takeaways and things that you're wrestling with, and whether that's individually or as a group. That really matters. A wonderful professor I had in seminary, she was an expert on how humans learn and grow, and she would tell us all the time, an ounce of reflection leads to a pound of learning. So with that in mind, encourage you to take a break from this, but come back to it in a few days or weeks and do some of that processing. And that's why, again, we build in some of those places in the slides for you to come back to and do that. And then the last thing I'll say is also kind of what we started with, and that is there's no way this will not impact you as a human. And so self-care is really simple. It's just about acknowledging how God has designed us, that we are humans. We have emotions, we have a spirit, we have bodies with needs. So to think about what you need mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally, and pay attention to that, because this has been a heavy time, right? And even if you're not a survivor of abuse, it will impact you. So just pay extra attention and be kind to yourself, and if your schedule allows, to get out and take a walk in the sunshine, or go visit the beach. You guys have a beach around here, right? I've heard. Okay. I'm going to go visit the beach later, I think. That really matters. A mentor of mine just said, look, if you attend to these issues or care about these issues, you have to cultivate resiliency and excuse me, reminding yourself that there is still good, and cultivating, God's beauty. So whatever that is for you, whether it's connecting with your family, friends, getting outside to do a walk, spiritual practices, just make sure you're paying attention to what you need, what your emotions are telling you, checking in with your support system as needed. All of that really, really matters. And definitely taking a break. So, like not getting Anna Salter one of her books and trying to read it tonight. Please don't do that. You need to take a break and go at a pace. So, all right. Well, I'm not going to rush out. If you want to stay behind and talk, if you have more questions, looking forward to being with you all tomorrow for church. And so you can catch me then as well. But please go get on that self-care. But if you have questions, if you want to talk to me offline or before you head out today, glad to do that as well. All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.